So there's a question of whether fat or carbohydrates is the best fuel source. And I've looked at it in terms of anthropology through Weston A. Price's work, through, genetics, through glycation and insulin, the metabolic approach. But then when I stumbled upon you and the quantum biological, explanation to which one is best, especially in modern society, I got a clear answer. It became very obvious. So the question is, Sarah, which energy source is best, fat or carbs?
There are actually, we can start at the basics with this. There's the Baltimore study, which is on men and women long term, and they found that those who were fat burners had better overall sort of health and weight and things like that. So there are very long term studies. Then, if we think about ancestors, like you said, carbohydrates are not available all year round anyway. So there would have been a time when our ancestors didn't have access to them. So we're definitely biologically primed to use fat or ketones. It's correct that what you said about insulin and glycation, but that would be more the processed or refined carbohydrates because they're completely different to, say, a freshly picked apple from your own garden versus Pringles and stuff manufactured in a factory that's got horrible quantum information. Then we can talk about something called deuterium, and fats are very low in deuterium, and carbs are high, and seed oils are very high. And deuterium, for the moment, is just, we'll say, heavy hydrogen, and it's heavy, so it has a metabolic burden in different parts of the body. For example, in the mitochondria, which we'll talk about, and then in hormonal systems. And then the other important thing about fat is it provides more electrons than glucose, and that means that there's going to be more ATP production, which is one energy source in the mitochondria. But also, when the mitochondria use fat as a fuel, they're going to make more metabolic water. So we can say using fat makes one equivalent of water. Protein is about 0.65, and then carbohydrates are half. So we get twice as much water as in metabolic water that the mitochondria make that's deuterium depleted, which is literally our life force in many ways. It's sort of our water battery. Everything in biology is covered in water or exclusion zone or fourth phase water. So everything inside our bodies happens through the medium of water. And true hydration doesn't mean drinking 8 glasses of tap water a day. That's wildly from the truth. And then finally, there's another interesting reason that if we think about the inside the mitochondria, there's a chain of proteins that the electrons have to go down. So we get the electrons and the protons, as in a H plus from food, and the electrons go down the electron transport chain. So it's like an electric current, and they interact with these proteins along the way, and then water gets produced. And then there's another step where ATP is produced. When electrons from fat go down this chain, they jump over the first complex and they go straight in at number two, and then they go all the way down to the end of the chain. And the reason this is really important is that complex number one in the mitochondria leaks electrons. And electrons that are escaping or leaking, we can think of them as free radicals, which, when it's uncontrolled, it's inflammatory, but also it's a big reason why people could get something like diabetes or obesity or inflammation or sickness, because these electrons are escaping, the ones that came from glucose, rather than going down the chain to make electric current. So there's that very sort of deep reason. And I think we could probably loop back and then unpack each of these ones in a little bit more detail, because this was sort of an introduction so people know what we're going to talk about. And I wanted it to be understandable to everybody. So maybe, Jones, you could represent yourself as your listeners and what they might ask based on these different reasons that I've given of why fat is a better fuel than glucose. I'm not saying that people should avoid carbs forever, not 1 minute, but the fat should be the primary fuel.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I was hinting at, like what I've learned from quantum biology that's really answered this question is, well, fat is low in deuterium, it gives us more electrons, and it gives us more water. And those three things are extremely crucial. And so that's why it must be superior. And since we're losing water through modern society, we're losing electrons, and we're getting a bunch of deuterium into us as well through modern society. If you live in modern society, it's probably a very wise choice to be using fat. And it's also more nutrient dense, which is another thing. Um, I think that's
Exactly. And also, yeah, that's a very good point. If you're inside all day, surrounded by Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and artificial blue light, it would be foolish to eat carbs, even if you live somewhere hot and sunny because you're inside. So absolutely, I agree that in modern day society, eating that way makes sense.
yes, and speaking of mitochondria and being inside and everything, locality is a thing. So I know that people like Jack Cruz, they say that you must eat locally because if you eat something from Ecuador, the way I understand it at least is that if you eat a banana from Ecuador and you're in Europe, your body will think that you're in Ecuador. So how does that work? Because I know that the mitochondrial complexes are the ones that read the information. So how does that really happen?
I think it's more than just the mitochondria that read it. I think it's the gut microbiome as well. So if we think about light, it's an electromagnetic wave. So we've got one aspect of the wave function that we'll just say goes like this, and then we've got one that runs perpendicular or 90 degrees, and that contains magnetic information. So already the light that the plant is going to use to do photosynthesis and make glucose and then go on to say make a banana or an apple or whatever, that there's information that's programmed in based on where that apple or banana grew. And also they grow in the ground as well. So they're going to collect information, additional information about their locality. Then when it comes to the mitochondria, like you said, complex 1 is a UV receptor. That's the leaky complex that we were talking about earlier. That's the ultraviolet accepting. Well, it's ultraviolet active. And say if somebody say if in Britain I ate a banana, the amount of confusing information that would give to my gut microbiome and my mitochondria, because they're both sorts of bacteria, so they communicate, and light and food will sort of produce light, and the gut microbiome, the light it receives should match our ambient or environmental light. So my gut microbiome should collect the same amount of light that I am in Leeds in the UK at the moment, which is pretty low. And then the kind of foods that contain carbs, because we can't grow plants without UV, I should be putting in plants that match the low level of light that I have here. So there are certain kinds of apples that grow here still. And then there are things like cabbage, and the apples that grow are very sour. So they're very low in sugar and glucose. So that's sort of matching the amount of light that I have here. If I suddenly ate a banana, first of all, the amount of sugar and deuterium in it doesn't match my environment. So it's going to create some kind of confusion in the microbiome area, because all of a sudden, all this deuterium, which potentially could be light emitting, as well as the light information in the banana, is going to massively confuse the gut. And so many people have gut issues, but also when it arrives in the mitochondria, because inside the mitochondria, it's like we said earlier, it's going to strip off the protons and the electrons. So the electrons that go into the mitochondria from the banana are going to contain really confusing information. And in physics, we call inflammation chaos, because it's an information mismatch that a lot of the times with our bodies, it's gathering information all the time to work out what we need to do right now, whether it's light or temperature or electrons or grounding or electric fields. So all of a sudden putting a banana into the mix will create an amount of confusion. And also back to the deuterium again, if you ate the banana where it grew, that's a very hot climate, so it's more sweaty, there's higher UV, so you're able to deplete some of that deuterium. Whereas in the UK at the moment, there isn't the correct kind of light or heat, and you can't have a sauna to undo it. That might get some deuterium out, but it won't get the bad information from the banana out. The other factor in this is as well that ultraviolet light causes us to cleave POMC, and one of the products is alpha MSH, and this makes melanin. So this is way beyond just a suntan, because melanin has the potential to split water into protons, oxygen, and electrons, but which means it can quench free radicals. And evidence is very strongly suggesting there's melanin in the mitochondria. So, say if I was living somewhere with lots of UV, I can eat the plants that live there, and they're going to be high sugar plants like mangoes and bananas. So when all of those electrons that go through complex 1 that we talked about before are escaping, instead of becoming inflammatory, if there's enough melanin, that it has the potential to quench or catch those free radicals. So that's why I said right at the beginning, there's nothing wrong with eating carbs. It completely depends on your environment and whether you actually go outside, because you can't make melanin inside because UV can't get through glass. So hopefully that is a sort of overview of it that people could understand. And then from a quantum physics and fields perspective, if people look into light and electromagnetism, there's a whole lot more information in there that we don't fully understand yet. Sort of the work of David Bohm talking about hidden variables and how nobody understands electricity or electric fields. And light is electromagnetic radiation. But then I think when it comes to ways of eating, a lot of people have a huge amount of success with carnivore, but keto didn't really work for them. And I think part of it's not the plant toxins. I think it's impossible to eat non-seasonal and non-local produce on carnivore because you can't eat any plants, so you can't do it wrong. Because there's also lots of loops in the law here. People grow plants hydroponically, and in the US, it'll just say on the label, produced in the USA, whereas something like Maine and Texas are thousands and thousands of miles apart. So when it comes to choosing seasonal and local, it's not quite as easy as people would think. It's easy in the UK because we're such a small island. I'm not sure about Sweden. You'll have to fill me in on that, but that would be sort of something for people to consider. I wouldn't say that a banana would make me think that I'm in where it came from. However, I don't fully understand the sort of intricacies of quantum physics in the body. I don't think anyone does. I would say what it'll do is it'll cause inflammation,
I see. And thinking,
confusion or chaos, because biology is based on predictions. That the way biology works, all it wants to do is know what's going to happen, because it's a survival mechanism. So if it's expecting apples, as in my mitochondria and my gut microbiome are expecting an apple I picked from my garden with the programmed information in it from the light that made the apple grow, and all of a sudden I put coconut water in, or a mango, it wasn't expecting that. And it's when biology gets a surprise, it doesn't like it. It's stressful. And, you can relate it back to people, that we like to know what we're going to be doing in the day. And if something unexpected happens, we don't like it either. So it's sort of the macro scale and then all the way down to the micro scale of biology. It doesn't want surprises.
yes, and going back to Weston A. Price's work, you look at all the healthy and isolated primitive tribes. People like to compare their diets with our current diets, but they never look at locality. All these healthy people have always eaten what's around them. They've never
Mm.
eaten anything from, another part of the world. So that's also something to consider.
And
Um,
also the indigenous people tend to be outside a lot, be it Eskimos and Inuit, that sort of cold. So they've got the cold exposure, and then lots of the tribes don't wear shoes or clothes. So you also need to factor in that. But that's a really good point, that they just would pick what they could basically gather or grab.
yeah, I mean, it's the only thing they have. They can't get it any other way. Um, but again, speaking of food, uh, I wanted to ask this question to Jack Cruz, but if someone goes back and watches my first interview with him, they'll understand why I didn't ask it. Um, but I wanted to ask about raw meat because
Oh,
I've been thinking about it from a quantum biological standpoint, and I've been eating it for I believe 4.5 years now. My diet is mostly raw meat, and other people have been doing it as well, and they come to me and they say, "Oh, I tried raw meat and I feel really, really good on it. It's the best kind of food group I've ever introduced to my diet." And so I thought about why it might be so good. And the first thing was, okay, well, you don't lose electrons. If you cook something, you oxidize it, so you lose electrons. You
Mhm.
also you don't lose any water as well. There's a lot of water in meat. Uh, and water contains a bunch of electrons as well. And so you don't lose that. And that's pretty good water. Um, yeah, and those are the main two things, I guess. And then there's the biomagnetic properties, but I don't really understand that. So I know that you eat raw meat. Would you say that this analysis is sort of correct? Would you add anything to that? Why do you think raw meat works so well for people?
I think I did my PhD in protein folding, so that's all about proteins being a linear string of amino acids, and then folding up into a quaternary or active structure, the quaternary structure of, say, a protein, and things like heat and urea and all sorts of things. We used to fold and unfold proteins all day long. And when you heat protein, you're obviously going to disturb or destroy this quaternary structure. And when you make sort of aggregates or bits of protein, this can be a bit confusing and potentially a bit irritating to the body. I'm not going to say that there are not advantages of eating cooked meat. I would just say we're just talking about structure now of protein, that the actual structural integrity of the protein is preserved. However, I would say that the way that people do cook meat, it's not sort of crazy heat. But you are going to alter the structure of the protein. But however, our ancestors would have cooked meat as well. So it's not like you're giving your body a surprise if you have cooked meat. Just to add here, something like a protein powder is or collagen peptides are just manufactured, denatured, um, very confusing bits of protein. Your body and mitochondria and gut microbiome have got no idea what this is. They don't recognize the structure. They don't recognize the information in it. So I think I don't think everybody should, if they don't want to, convert to raw meat. But I think also there are all sorts of sort of micronutrients in meat because I raw fish as well that we haven't isolated yet because there's in such a tiny quantity and they could be potentially disrupted by heat. Also, vitamin C's heat labile, and we can get vitamin C from things like raw liver or raw meat, and we don't need very much vitamin C. It's a bit of a misnomer about needing 1 gram. It's something like 20 to 50 milligrams if you're not inflamed. So there's also a suite of nutrients that you can access from raw meat and also fish and eggs because the eggs have got lots of fat in them, all different sorts, like phospholipids and things like that. And if we overheat egg yolks, then we oxidize and destroy helpful fats. And then with seafood, I used to work also on another project, which is something different, on membranes and cholesterol. And if we ordered omega-3s to use in the lab, they always arrived on ice. And, if they got too hot or whatever, they would lose their efficacy. So there's lots of advantages to protecting those kind of heat sensitive nutrients. But on the complete converse, something like oxtail soup, you because it gets cooked for that long, um, uh, you release a whole suite of completely different nutrients that isn't accessible in raw meat. And there's not just one type of collagen, there are lots. And then there are all sorts of related connective tissues like elastin. And then there's all sorts of other um, nutrients and things when you cook bones for a long time. Because I'm very much now, I always look at, I don't think there's, if for example, I'm just what I'm getting to here is light's really important, but dark's really important. Saunas are really important. Cold is really important. I think here it's like we've got the extreme. The very, very long cooked meat will open up a suite of nutrients, and then the completely raw that has a whole set of nutrients um, to themselves. And if I had to choose whether I ate oxtail every day or raw meat, it would be raw meat every time because with oxtail, it's something I'll have maybe once a week. And so that's my view. I completely agree with you what you said about the water and the electrons and the information. Also, when we tend to cook meat, you can create a reaction in the frying pan, not to scare people, but you can make something called acrylamide. So that's good. It's just there's a special name for the reaction, and I'll remember it as soon as we finish this podcast. That it's what makes the meat go brown on the outside. It's a very
Maillard reaction.
Yes, yes, yeah, because that can potentially produce a little bit of thank you, of acrylamide, and that's just just a bit irritating to the body. But again, it all completely depends how people cook their meat. Because some people just put the steak in the pan and then they put it in for 1 second, turn it over, and take it out. So I wouldn't count that really as cooking. That's kind of sealing. And then with sausages and burgers, most people cook them all the way through, so that'll be very cooked. So hopefully that and also the other thing that I found, because I have had to travel a lot over the past 3 years, that when I went to Switzerland, I stayed somewhere really remote, and there was this van that you used to be able to get produce from, but all the meat was frozen, and I didn't have any kind of cooking apparatus, and I definitely didn't want to go to a restaurant in Switzerland because of the price. So that's when the whole raw meat began, and I noticed that I didn't have any gut issues at all. I don't get gut issues anyway, but I just noticed normally when you travel, there is a bit of disruption to your gut that I felt amazing instantly with the raw Swiss meat. And then every time I travel, I always warm up to my flight because I always fast when I fly or travel, and I always do raw meat and fish before I fly for certain. And then when I get to the new location, I'll always look for raw meat. Raw fish in other countries, I'm a bit suspicious of, to be a bit careful. And I never have any sort of gut issues. And quite a lot of other people have said the same. And I think actually people who want to transition into carnivore for an experiment, actually doing raw first is probably the best way round because it's so sort of smooth on the gut. I'm not sure if you feel the same.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's not just me, because my own personal experience, sure, like now I know what works for me. But then, I got all these comments and these emails of people telling me, oh, I tried raw meat and, it feels amazing. It
Mm,
digests much better.
mm.
So people saying that cooking breaks down the proteins, making it more easy to digest, I believe there's something wrong there. There must
Yeah,
be something wrong there.
they're altering the actual quaternary or the actual structure of the protein because the protein has quaternary, tertiary, secondary, and primary structure. So there is an alteration, and it's obviously going to distort all of the bonds and how the water is arranged. And again, just to add here, I'll let you carry on. Microwaving meat and food is even worse because the way that you'll distort the bonds in and even the electrons in microwave food is like making a concoction that's really confusing to your mitochondria and your body.
No, but what blows my mind is that, you get the gastric acid down there in the stomach, and it's breaking down raw meat better than cooked meat. And cooked meat,
Mm.
again, is supposed to be broken down by the heat. So the entire, it's backwards thinking, based on anecdotal evidence, of course. I wish there were raw meat studies, but of course, good luck getting subjects for that. Um, but
But also, I think back to denatured proteins, they're sort of all scrunched up, like and they're all scrunched up like this, we can imagine. So when enzymes want to come and chop them up, the shape of it isn't the same as say in say uncooked meat because the shape is sort of more natural. So the things that want to chew up the meat can potentially do their job better. That's just my theory based on working with enzymes and proteins. I might be completely wrong, but I think there's a lot to it, and people for some reason there's so much misinformation about everything. So there are people who get really angry if I say I eat raw meat, and it's like, and then they'll list off a whole load of reasons, and I think none of these are even proved. So it's definitely one of the suck it and see for yourself, the raw meat. I wouldn't recommend raw pork or chicken. I know some people do that because I don't eat chicken or pork anyway, but definitely beef I've always found to be very easy to digest raw.
I mean, I currently only do raw chicken, so
All right, okay, you'll have
just
to.
just throwing that out there.
Oh,
But
no, that's fine. Yeah. Do you want to elaborate? Because when I went to, I can't remember who I was talking to. I went to a conference to speak, and it was a carnivore and spiritual conference, and Anthony Chafee was there. But then I went to another one in Portugal, and Cameron Borg You might know him. He's a very smart guy. The Richie Flow podcast. He deserves a shout out for quantum and his brain. One of them definitely said to me, "Oh, because I said, oh, I don't eat. I'd never eat raw chicken. It's horrible. I just wouldn't." And they went, "Oh no, there's a guy in Sweden that does, and it's like a big thing." So maybe do you want to give your side of the story on the chicken? Because like I'm always open to new suggestions, and maybe I've been brainwashed to be told chicken's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of bacterial food poisoning, the way I think about it is you've got the muscles of an animal in the cow, and you've also got the muscles of an animal in the chicken. And bacteria are not responsible for their environment. So whatever would cause disease would be something within the tissue that would react together, or it would be a part of the environment that the bacteria are in, and then they would eat that bad thing and produce bad things. So as long as the chicken is healthy, you won't get any problems. That's the way I view it. And I'm in Sweden, I'm picking pretty good chicken, so for me, I mean, in terms of sickness, it doesn't matter. The reason I do it over beef is because a while ago I started getting, increased heart rate. And what I noticed was that when I ate raw chicken, it slowed down a lot. So that's really why I'm eating raw chicken right now. It's a tool that's available in my arsenal because I'm not really afraid of it. And the nutrient profile of it differs. So again, Augenis Vonderplanitz, the guy I talked about before we started recording, he said that some people need more white meat, others need more red meat because the nutrient profile is different. And depending on which one you prefer taste-wise, because your body tells you which nutrients you need through the
Hmm.
mouth, that's the one you should eat. So he also said that some people might go through periods of wanting to eat red meat as opposed to white meat or white meat as opposed to red meat. And if someone's really balanced, let's say they don't have any nutrient problems because they're pretty healthy, a blend of both is probably a pretty good idea. So that's really why I'm eating raw chicken right now. Yeah.
You've raised lots of really important points because with the bacteria and the chicken, I think exactly as you said, there's two different populations of chicken, battery reared chickens that are dirty, and then chickens that you have yourself in your own garden. But also having worked a lot with bacteria, they don't readily move environments for you. Like you can I used to do quite a lot of recombinant DNA technology. And even if you put things on agar plates and put them in the incubator, they don't always grow. So this idea of parasites and bacteria, if you eat a chicken and then put it in yourself, my environment, the environment in my stomach is wildly different to the environment in a chicken leg. And the kind of bacteria that say we'll just pretend lived in muscle, that they wouldn't survive in stomach acid. And they I agree with you there for certain. And I think because you raised another important point. Oh, I know what it was about us just knowing what food to eat and when. Like liver's a good example. If people eat too much liver, and I've done this before, and I think lots of other people have, all of a sudden it starts to be repellent and you just don't fancy it. And this is what I was saying about there's so much more to information, food and our bodies and subtle energy and hidden variables that we don't understand yet. But there's an aspect of us that if we're in tune with our biofields and our bodies, we can just intuitively know, okay, I'm going to switch from beef to lamb, or I'm not going to have any liver this week. So that's also another really important point that you raised, because with the raw meat, it's not like I want to do it. I chose, I didn't think, oh, I'm doing this because somebody told me it's healthy. I just did it and it felt right. How did you transition into raw meat?
Um, well, there was a guy called, well, first of all, I was a vegan.
Oh,
Then
lovely. Okay.
there was a guy called Frank Tufano who basically explained through
Oh,
his
I
own
love
video.
Frank. Yes.
Yes, he explained that animal foods are the most nutrient dense and bioavailable. So I said, okay, I have a bunch of acne. Let me try that out. And then I watched another video of his where he talked about Augenis Vonderplanitz and that he was ahead of his time in terms of his nutrition understanding. And then I went, okay, well, let me look him up. So I looked him up. I found a 5 hour lecture. I listened to it. And then I said, okay, I need to find high quality raw animal foods immediately. And so I just started eating raw meat because of that. And it's the best food group in terms of getting fat and protein and nutrients and that I've ever found. Nothing trumps it really. So that's how I got into it. Yes.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
interesting. I know Frank has a wealth of information on his channel, but then didn't he then go into the pro metabolic, and he's even got his own meat company, but he's an interesting character. People mock him, but for a young guy, I used to listen to him and he was a very interesting person, I think. And yes, and I just leave all of the other aspects of him. I haven't watched any videos of him for years. He's probably doing something different, but that's an interesting way you put it. Because also, I'm like you. If something needs to get changed because I've learned I shouldn't be doing something, I'll just stop doing it straight away. Whereas other people get really angry if you tell them collagen peptides are full of deuterium. It's like I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm just trying to help you. And that's the kind of thing I do. Maybe that 5 hour video may be available somewhere still for people because it is something we haven't got time to explain it all. And that video obviously made you make a massive change instantly. So there must be something to it.
Yeah, I mean, Alginus, if you're interested, he has a book called We Want to Live, and he also has a book called The Recipe for Living Without Disease. If you're
Mm,
interested in his work, I highly recommend those two books. Those are his main work.
mm.
Again, he's also got lectures and everything. He's the main person who's driven people to eat raw animal foods diets. Some people, of course, stumble upon them through the way you did in Switzerland, which is, really cool, actually. But most people, I'd say, in modern society stumble upon raw animal foods diets through Argenus wonderplanets. But
But also, I think raw anything is, especially animal products, has been demonized because we had the salmonella crisis with Edwina Curry in the UK. I can't remember when, it was probably 20 or 25 years ago, and that scared people off eggs, especially raw ones. And then pregnant women are told to never eat runny egg yolks. And then there's obviously a humongous fear over raw milk. And then raw meat, it says even on the package, there's sometimes I buy this really delicious Aberdeen Angus and it says, do not consume this raw. So there's also the constant brainwashing or being told you must always cook meat. And then this idea of the paradigm shift into eating it raw, I think is a big thing for people to grasp.
and I think most of the food poisoning is occurring due to pollution. And I think we're blaming the bacteria because they're found there. Like there's this guy called Weston Rowe who I did an interview with. They found E. coli 0H1 0157H7
Mm.
in his colon, in his stool. And that's supposed to be an E. coli that's associated with, the children that eat raw chicken and then they get kidney failure and die. That's the same strain, by the way, and he's symptom free. So I believe it's the interaction between pollution and bacteria that's the problem, and especially the pollution. The bacteria are just there, but the pollution is the thing making us sick. But
Oh,
in any,
definitely. Because also the kind of light or EMFs that you grow bacteria in changes their behavior and properties. And also heavy metals tends to provoke not just us, but other living things as well. So I think exactly as you said, it's the person that the environment of the person in which the bacteria found itself will dictate the outcome. But definitely the E. coli 0157, that's the one that often breaks out in festivals when people eat partially cooked, burgers. But then people in festivals are sort of drunk and high the whole time and sleeping out in tents and probably really drunk as well, or, drunk as well. So I think that's a really interesting idea. But I think it's very difficult to explain this or demystify or take away the fear to the general population because they'll also tell me, oh no, I don't want to eat meat or eggs at all because of parasites. Because what's your thought there? Because I tend to just leave parasites alone for lots of reasons. And it's the same idea, I think, as the bacteria. It depends on the host and how much deuterium you've got, how much heavy metals you've got, all sorts of things. What are your thoughts on parasites?
I have two thoughts on parasites. One is that there's a study that I learned about from Argenus Wonderplanets, where there's this guy called Joel Weinstock, may he rest in peace. He did a study where he introduced trichinella into
Mhm.
people's intestines. Um, and what happened was, and these people had IBD, by the way, infectious bowel disease, as they call it. And a huge percentage of them remitted. They got well just
Mm.
through this parasite therapy. So they're clearly a part of the microbiome. And there's also the observation that in countries where they have a higher prevalence of parasites in their in their microbiomes, they have less allergies, they have less food intolerances as well. So their immune system function is better in general, and they tend to be countries that are more polluted. And they might also have lower quality food available, but still they have, again, they also have a lot of sun because we're mostly talking about Africa. But in general, they have less food intolerance problems, less allergies. So based on these things, based on the fact that parasites are a natural part of the microbiome, I don't fear them. I'd say that getting them into there is probably a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. Because also evolutionarily, they've been with us ever since we've existed. And it's sort of like you say, I've read some of these studies as well. And I've found that trying to get rid of them and removing them actually creates more problems. And I think when we talk about the gut microbiome, this is another important thing that there's about 1 trillion fungi in there. There's the fungal microbiome. And talking about just bacteria is a sort of more commercial thing. Whereas what people forget is there's amoeba and all sorts in there. It's not just bacteria, and all of these microorganisms have been there forever, and they do serve a purpose. And for certain parasites and bacteria, they eat different things than we do. Like all microorganisms love deuterium because their ATPase is different to ours, so it doesn't damage. And then there are bacteria that eat mercury and iron and all sorts. So I think there's a role for them in us because exactly as you said, it's more polluted places. Um, and there would be more deuterium as well at the equatorial places. And I think these microorganisms are part of sequestering these things in the environment. So I think that's a sort of a big issue. And with people in raw meat, the parasites will always get mentioned.
Going back to, because we've been talking about microorganisms and raw meat, that's usually something I talk about a lot on my channel. But of course, since you're here, I want to ask you the questions that I'm not really good at. Um, why is the sunrise so important? Because I know that 2 years ago, Andrew Huberman popularized the term sunlight viewing, so getting morning sunlight. But obviously, that's not the same as the sunrise. So what's the difference there?
With the sunrise, there's a particular unique blend of red and blue and violet light, and it's about activating our HPA axis. So we've got like hormonal cascades, and this is very high up. So I just explain to people it switches on the cascade of hormones that we need for the day at the right time, and then the UV will switch off some of these pathways. Also, the other thing about the sunrise is the information programmed in, and I don't know how this happens, but our body clocks, as in our organ clocks, our gene clocks, our cell clocks, they all drift throughout the day and they require being reset at sunrise. Then, in terms of other wave properties, because the sun produces scalar waves as well, and there's something that happens called four wave phase conjugation, which is sort of getting into sort of work of people like Dan Winter. And this particular combination of waves converging on a 0 point or compressing or imploding provides a sort of people would describe it more sort of spiritually. It's much easier to get into a bliss state in this particular environment, and a bliss state is something where it's very physics orientated, but the thing that comes out is you access, it's not a flow state, it's a state where you can do things like lucid dreaming or astral projection, get pure focus, but it's also an environment where healing and bodily functions are extremely aligned and coherent. So this would be, we can imagine this particular combination of waves makes us coherent in the morning, and then throughout the day it'll drift, but then you've got the same combination of this special four wave mixing that happens at sunset, but the actual light that's at sunset different. So that what happens to our body clocks is different in the evening compared to the morning. But what happens with this being able to compress and implode and get into this sort of bliss state, I think it's to do with we start off the day well, then everything all goes wrong, and then we've got the sunset again to recompress, sort of cohere the body. So that's sort of two different explanations of why sunrise and sunset are so important. But that the sunrise is the one that can set the body clocks. The sunset obviously is more programmed to winding down because, like I said, biology is all predictive and it takes ages to shut down the organs and certain activities. So the sunset sets that in motion so that we can prepare and get ready for sleeping. So that's sort of the predictive thing. If it suddenly got dark, that would be a disaster for our ancestors. So that's sort of in a nutshell of why the sunrise is so important. There are also aspects of something called the central retinol pathway, which is another very high up pathway that involves thyroid hormone. I think that's the long loop. And then there's the short loop, which is related to recycling DHA. And this particular pathway gets activated in the morning. And studies have shown that morning light is vital for sort of metabolism. And if we unpick what that would mean, it would be regarding leptin signaling and thyroid signaling. So the way in which sort of energy setting happens is a morning light activity. The other important thing about sunrise is about the TCA cycle in the mitochondria, that we need the morning light, the combination of seeing the sunrise and most likely the UV as well, because the TCA cycle it turns. It can go backwards as well, but for simple terms, it turns and it pushes the protons and the electrons where they need to go in the mitochondria. So there's an important aspect of being a efficient fat burner that relies on the light in the morning for this to happen. And there are numerous studies about BMIs and obesity and leptin and ghrelin and using subjects who received morning light. And I think when I was looking at it the other day, it was between 45 minutes to 90 minutes. So just going out for 2 minutes is acceptable, I suppose, but you're not going to give your body a chance to reap all the benefits of sunrise because there's lots.
Okay. And speaking of the sunrise, I've heard Dr. Jack Cruz say that it's very important to eat 30 minutes after seeing the sunrise. Now, I don't understand why that is. I thought that we should eat when our body tells us to eat. But he's even written that if you have adrenal fatigue, you're probably not going to want to eat in the morning because your cortisol levels are low. So is it tied to increasing cortisol? What is it tied to?
I don't think anyone knows for certain, but when I've looked into it, once the UV arrives, we can start to behave like a solar panel. So we can glean energy from more so from the environment. So it's not just light and grounding. There are other things in the environment we can get energy from. Whereas before that, there isn't any UV light. So the body's dependent on you putting in food electrons. Then there are as a pathway relating to leptin and appetite regulation further on through the day. But when it comes to people with adrenal fatigue, it's hard to unpack that because you need to work out why have they got adrenal fatigue? Have they sat in blue light all day? Have they got a horrible circadian rhythm? Because it might be it's a gut clock issue. But in terms of the window of eating, I would, when I tell people what to do, I would just say, look in my circadian app and eat before the UVA arrives. And I just say because the body will start behaving differently when the UVA comes. There's all sorts of other things that happen with UV, like making more alpha MSH, dopamine, serotonin, and alpha MSH is an appetite suppressant. So it would make sense that if the UV arrives and the appetite's being suppressed, there's a reason for that. So it would make sense to do the eating before this particular block of sort of light arrives and then other biochemical changes happen.
Hmm, interesting. Would that also be relevant, like in very high latitudes? because then you don't really have a lot of UV.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's one of these things that it does depend because obviously if you lived in El Salvador, the UV comes pretty quickly and it's really strong. So if 100% what I've explained there would make sense, when it comes to sort of northern latitudes, because the sun can come up at like 3 a.m. in Scandinavia, and there are places, as you know, because you live there, where there's 24 hours of daylight. So I don't know the answer to that one. I don't think anybody does. Um, but we do make our own UV, and that would be when we're cold. But on the other hand, I really just have no idea to that because I think it's an anomaly when we talk about living in places with such unstable light environments. And there are lots of problems associated with people living in places like that. So it's not ideal. And I wouldn't know the answer. Although we have to then also think, okay, we haven't got this light anymore as a timekeeper, and then things like cold and food are zeitgebers or timekeepers as well. So eating when you get up, it's another signal to tell your body this is morning and the day's starting. So that's why I would suggest that people do eat breakfast in those environments because it's just you're using a secondary zeitgeber for your clocks. It's not as good as light, of course, but it's still better than nothing, if that makes sense.
What are your favorite books, resources, and people? Again, books, resources, and people that have, you know, helped you help yourself in terms of health and your clients as well.
Oh, this is so massive because I've had like over 20 years, probably longer, to be able to do stuff on my own. And I think if we talk about water first, there's Dr. Batmanjeli and about our body's cry for water. He's an Iranian doctor, and I learnt about this when I did massage and Pilates and worked a lot with fascia. So that's a very interesting sort of concept. But then on the other subject of water, I think Gerald Pollack's Fourth Phase of Water is a really good book for anybody. I think it's hard, but then maybe I'm just slow, but I think it's something that my mother could understand if she made the effort to read it. So those two. Oh, there's so many books. I mean, it has to be in different categories. I think John Ott's book about light, that's really good. Um, Albert St. Georgie has a book on light. Oh, I've read so many books through my life. I'd have to open my gigantic collection, or just even on Audible, because there are things like Nick Lane's books on mitochondria and oxygen. Those are very informative. I've got the Weston A. Price's book. That's another book I'd say that's a very good read in the nutrition category. Um, and then when it comes to electromagnetism and grounding, there are all sorts of books. Dr. Pollock's got a book on electromagnetism. Um, then Dr. Laura Conover she's an MD, has a really good book explaining grounding. The most recent book that blew my mind was The New Science of Heaven. That's Professor Robert Temple's book on plasma, because that's another very important subject, the plasma and the ether and what's the medium that we exist in, because it's not air. We've got the ether or the plasma, which is just in simple terms charge that spins. So I think of all the books that really blew my mind recently, I would say Robert Temple's book. I think I've read it and listened to it maybe 20 times now. And then also lots of Rupert Sheldrake's books. I've probably read all of them several times. And I found that extremely interesting for understanding why Rene Descartes and this idea the body's just a machine is wrong. But also it goes into something I'm really interested in, which are fields. Because I mentioned David Bohm earlier talking about hidden variables in fields, and then Rupert Sheldrake and the morphic field. This sort of ties into what I said before about the bliss state, where sort of telepathy and these kind of things, which are not paranormal, they're just normal activities that humans can do, become easier to do. And Rupert Sheldrake talking about why genes, it can't just be genetics. There has to be something which informs the field, or gives it, like, it informs why my nose is the shape it is. There's no gene for that, and why leaves have a certain shape. And then also the idea of how behaviors and personality traits and how quickly people learn things are transferred through these fields, because the sooner people get out of the idea that they're just a lump of meat, and they're much more, they're a fascinating biophysical thing. I think it's extremely important for hope and mood and just general understanding of life. So I think those kind of books are very important for people, because the same as you, because you work with clients, and I often find the problem is it's not the light, it's not the food, it's not the water, it's their mindset and worldview. And looking into people like Dean Radin, again, he talks a lot about how we're much more than we think. And I'm just starting on Dr. Konstantin Korotkov's work, which is down the same route, because he's an extremely well-published quantum physicist with about 300 papers. And he has built a machine called BioWell, which is sort of like a super Killian photography device for being able to look at our plasma body, or our aura is just made of plasma, because there are problems which manifest in the plasma body and then appear in the physical body, same as an idea. We always think of that in the ether somewhere, and then we create the thing. And it might sound like a massive amount of woo, but it's when you dive into the Russians' research, especially Konstantin Korotkov, he's extremely meticulous with his science, and he's also an expert on light and water as well. So that would be sort of more high level, because I've given some sort of easier books. In terms of quantum biology, I mean, there's Life on the Edge by Jim Al-Khalili and John Joe McFadden, but that's, I think, a bit out of date now. But it's a really good window for people to be explained in simple terms what quantum effects are, and quantum biology in the body and in enzymes and all of the other things they describe. So that there's lots of things, there's so many, and I think it's something that they would have to do a whole like book review podcast.
Yeah, I see. I mean, do you want to still get into haplotypes or
Oh yes, definitely. Because I was already. I mean, I think we've got time, because obviously this is I've got into a flow now, like a flow state, and I definitely prepared trying to explain haplotypes yesterday, because I'm going to make a short YouTube video with slides for people, because it's one of these things when we talk about mitochondria and haplotypes. I think it's a very visual topic, that we can talk about the electron transport chain and things, but then people actually need to see a picture of it, and to be able to sort of process what we're talking about. So I think with haplotypes or haplogroups, first of all, the mitochondria have 37 genes of their own. And what we're talking about here is polymorphisms, or SNPs. So changes in this mitochondrial DNA over a long period of time, when our ancestors moved from somewhere hot and sunny to somewhere cold and dark. And the mitochondria adapted, because the people that lived at the equator, that we'd call that a coupled haplotype. So the electrons go down the electron transport chain very efficiently, and not many escape. And not much heat escapes either, because it's not necessary somewhere hot. And again, that's why those people tend to be more carb tolerant, that the people with a coupled haplotype and L0 to 3, that they can eat carbs, and because it's more efficient, the electrons are less likely to escape out of complex 1, assuming they go outside. And this means that they're more efficient. So we can think of people like Usain Bolt and some top athletes who will be a L sort of haplotype. They've got very efficient mitochondria and very good sports performance. However, when you start to move more north, the biggest problem for our ancestors would have been it was really cold. So what the mitochondria did, they changed so that they were able to uncouple ATP production, because the whole process is called oxidative phosphorylation. So it was able to uncouple that from making ATP. And what happens here is some of the protons get recycled by something called an uncoupling protein. And what the overall result is, the energy can be dissipated as heat. So people with an uncoupled haplotype, they have less efficient mitochondria in terms of making ATP, and potentially more leakiness. I don't know for certain, but based on what I've read, I would say that it's less efficient, but they're better at making heat, which was something really important for our survival. So, in simple terms, the way this relates to, say, me living somewhere cold and dark, it would make more sense for me to use the capacity of our mitochondria to produce heat for myself and then eat a diet that was primarily fat and protein, because again, I would imagine my system is not quite as efficient, so feeding lots of glucose into it's going to make that inefficiency more apparent in my environment. And then if I don't use the cold and overeat, I'm kind of opening myself up to getting sort of really fat, because people think, oh, if I just eat loads of food and it all turns into heat, I can just eat whatever I want. But it doesn't work like that. You've got to actually activate this uncoupling pathway by using the cold. And both haplotypes, it doesn't matter what you are, if you just sit inside all day, you're screwed basically, because even if you are a coupled haplotype and you just sit inside all day eating carbs, you're not utilizing the sun, because that's a really important component of this as well. So again, looping back to what we talked about at the beginning about locality, it's really important that you match your mitochondrial haplogroup with where you live. So say if somebody who is an L1 moved to the UK, they couldn't eat sort of African food like bananas and such like, because they're living in completely the wrong environment. Even though they have got more efficient mitochondria, they would adopt the food that we eat here. And when it comes to doing cold thermogenesis, they just don't have the capacity to make as much heat as I would. So they can do cold thermogenesis because all cells, when they get cold, will make UV light. And if you overdo cold, or if you're an L haplotype and you try and do loads of ice baths, it's not compatible with your mitochondria's ability to make heat. So I think that answers two of your questions in one, because you did ask also, do I think cold thermogenesis is stressful? Yes, it could be for somebody with an L or a coupled haplotype overdoing it. Whereas somebody like, I don't know what your haplotype is, mine's a T, so I know I'm good to go. And I have to use the cold here at the moment because the sun is, I don't have that as much UV as I would say in the summer.
Interesting. And I guess that, some people say that it's stressful not only because your mitochondria create a lot of heat, but because your body, or they need to create more energy in general to heat you up. Uh, they also say that it's stressful because it feels very unpleasant as opposed to wearing warm clothes. And I guess that a healthy human being at a higher latitude, they don't feel pain in the, like when they're cold adapted, when they're in the cold. They actually feel quite pleasant. Is that your experience?
Yeah, definitely, because you've also highlighted something else really important about being cold adapted, because like I said, biology is slow and it won't dive into the brown fat and make all of the appropriate enzymes for altering the metabolism, because the brown fat is the key also for um, sort of cold thermogenesis. If somebody's not cold adapted and then they jump into a lake here or in Sweden, they don't have the biochemical capacity yet to be able to um, respond properly, and they'll just get really uncomfortable and shivery. And one of the tests is you can test your rectal temperature or another place before and after exposing yourself to the cold, and it should shoot up. Because even if I get in the bath for 30 seconds and it's cold, if I pee after, it's really warm. So my biology was already ready and I'm very cold adapted. So for people who have an uncoupled haplotype and they live say somewhere cold. You can do CT anywhere. It's not just for northern latitudes. You have to gradually do it and become cold adapted over time, because biology is slow. And say if somebody started doing cold therapy and had a cold shower followed by a hot one, that would sort of disturb the process of becoming cold adapted, because you want to give everything a chance to adapt to this new temperature. The other important thing that you pointed out was about hormesis, that if people had to come and visit my house, they'd want 5 coats on. But because I've been like this all my life, because my parents, especially my mum, didn't like turning the heating on, and we had a high ceiling. So I've been exposed to the cold all my life, so I don't even notice. I actually sort of like the feeling, because cold thermogenesis also encourages the production of neurotransmitters like dopamine and noradrenaline, those kind of compounds that are UV active as well. So the cold is another way to compensate for not being able to have signals from as much UV from the sun, because I have to make my own and make my own neurotransmitters. And that's again why cold usage in the winter is really important, because that's the time when people in certain places are wide open to depression and things like that.
So to just so I understand, the way I used to think about it is that when you do cold exposure, it's like hitting the gas pedal um in a car and making the engine go, in overdrive. I thought you did the same thing with the mitochondria and that damaged them. So how is it that
Oh,
you can,
oh no, carry on.
yeah, so how is it that you can, increase the energy demand by like 3 to 4 fold and not damage the mitochondria?
Okay, so when the mitochondria get hot, say you get cold and they all of a sudden like go for it, they're going to create heat. And then like I said at the beginning, everything in biology is surrounded by water. So when water heats up, it's going to compress the electron transport chain. So when you get cold, it squashes the electron transport chain close together, because cold and magnetism are associated with compression in lots of different ways. So basically, you squash the electron transport chain closer together. And when it comes to the way the electrons tunnel, the less distance they've got to go, the less likely they are to get lost on the way. And I think it's something like for every angstrom they get closer together, it's 10 times more efficient. So the cold actually creates more efficient mitochondria, so they pump out less free radicals when they shouldn't be. And that's why cold is actually a really important part of anti-aging, because it's a similar effect to exercise, but there's like, it's different in terms of how much ATP you produce. So it's a way of using energy in a very clean way, because exercise is inherently inflammatory. Not that we shouldn't do it, but it's just a different process, because the mitochondria are going for it as well when we exercise. But then it's not the same effect as the cold. I'm sure there is an amount of compression of the chain. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But definitely with the cold, the way it works is it compresses the electron transport chain. And then if we look back to Doug Wallace's work on heteroplasmy, one way to describe heteroplasmy would be the respiratory proteins spreading out. So the electrons are more likely to get lost, and then we've got more free radicals that we shouldn't have and more inflammation. Another part of Dr. Wallace's work, of course, was mitochondrial DNA mutations. But for certain with the cold, there's a lot more to it than people think. And I find it a very important tool. I would say personally, if someone asked me what's your top 10 anti-aging tip, I would say cold thermogenesis. But you're completely correct that if, say, someone has thyroid disease or adrenal fatigue or other things, if you chuck them in the cold, it just creates a massive amount of cortisol, and the mitochondria might or not be optimized to start with for whatever reason, and they may not have the correct accompanying biochemistry to be able to fully uncouple and get the benefits. But it doesn't mean they can't do it. They just have to do it slowly, because say with someone with adrenal fatigue or thyroid disease, if they do cryotherapy, that's transfer of heat through air, and it's not the same. Whereas getting into actual cold water, the way in which the heat is transferred, as in we can think about me losing heat to the water and cooling down is much more dramatic. So there's so many different kinds of cold thermogenesis, even just turning the heating down or not wearing a scarf when you go outside, that's still going to promote an amount of cold thermogenesis, or not drying yourself with a towel when you've got out of the bath or the shower, because anything below body temperature counts as cold thermogenesis to the body. It's just there are certain temperatures, like you've got deep CT and CT, where the effect is much more dramatic. So people would build up. And like I said before, people with L and coupled haplotypes, there's only so far they can go with cold because they definitely don't have the mitochondrial capacity to uncouple and make heat. So it becomes very stressful. But it doesn't mean they can't do it. They just would do it less or warmer.
I want to be respectful of your time, so where can people find you?
I just go by Busy Superhuman on online. So I've got a Substack for people that like reading and looking at pictures. I've got Instagram, which is sort of more short form. I've got a YouTube channel, which is a mixture of podcasts and sort of slightly longer form video. I've got plenty of free resources as well. Under lots of my posts, there's sort of links to things like a quantum kickstart, which walks people through 10 steps of how to start with quantum biology. I've got things introducing leptin to people, hormones through a quantum lens, that's free. Then something called a quantum clear out, which sort of talks about sort of coherence in the body. And I've got one on deuterium. So there's lots and lots of free things that people can dive into. And then again, there's plenty of free content for them to look at. I do have other sort of paid things, such as a membership group or paid courses. But I think for someone who's new, there's so much free information to get started, because when you open the quantum vortex, it's like trying to drink from a fire hydrant. So people can get massively overwhelmed very quickly. And I think it's just like cold thermogenesis. You've got to gradually work your way through quantum biology. And the most important thing, I think, with quantum biology is don't just learn about it, you've got to do it. Because the theory could get so complicated that even top physicists don't understand anymore. But the practical way you apply it is very, very simple, I think.
Thank you, Sarah.